Hello, and welcome to the BOFIN Buzz, the podcast for anyone fascinated by farming's future. Well, hello, and welcome again to the BOFIN Buzz, and part 2 of our delve into the weird and wonderful world of social science. I'm just before I introduce our guest for today, a note for BASIS members. So, as you know, the BOFIN Buzz now attracts BASIS points. So, to claim your CPD point, carry on listening, and we will give you details towards the end of the podcast about how to claim that point. But our special guest this week for the second part is Stacia Stetkiewicz, who is an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham. So, hello, Stacia.
Hi again,
Well,
Tom.
Stacia, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a assistant professor of sustainable agricultural systems, and for those of you who are wondering about my slightly unusual accent, I'm actually American. I grew up in the Northeast of the United States, and my parents took over the family farm when I was about 7 years old. But I guess you'd call it a small holding. It's very small indeed these days, gradually decreases every few years. But it hasn't been profitable for several generations now. So, although when I grew up, I was really interested in becoming a farmer and nature and the environment, that kind of career path was obviously not going to be an option for me. So, I shifted into research and science
I see.
instead.
So, but when you were growing up on the farm, did you always want to be a farmer? Was that the yearning back then? Yeah.
It certainly was. Yeah. I don't know if the series The Little House books made it over to the UK, but it's a very popular series about the pioneering life in the 1800s in the US, and they farm extensively. And I really wanted to take over the family farm, and I wanted to buy all of the houses that had started to box us in, knock them down, and replant them all. But that would require winning the lottery, and that's unfortunately not happened yet.
Right. So you studied. Where did you start your studies then?
So I did my undergraduate degree in plant biology at the University of
Right.
Edinburgh, and did a lot of sort of plant biology, ecology type courses. But when I got to my dissertation project, I actually focused on the perception of genetically modified plants and crops. And that's how I started getting interested in social science and social science methods and how we can apply them to some of these big natural science questions that we have.
I see. Uh, so you did most of your studies. Well, you did your undergraduate studies at Edinburgh.
Yeah.
You're now at the University of Nottingham. What sort of brought you from one to the other, so to speak?
Well, I did my PhD at Edinburgh as well in Scotland's Rural College, looking at integrated pest management in spring barley. And then I sort of moved around the UK, gradually coming further south, Stirling to Lancaster, and then down to Nottingham, the weather improving with every move. uh, Kind of following the research opportunities that were available to me, getting more interested in the social science side of things, getting more interested in crop breeding, and then, yeah, ended up here at Nottingham where there's a great,
Hmm.
agricultural research history and the farm on the campus. So you can actually get out and walk in the field in between classes, which is fantastic, and lots of exciting research going
Yeah.
on.
Now you mentioned involvement in GM crops in a minute, and the reason that I'm particularly interested in talking about GM crops is because, as listeners of Part One will know, we have just launched our PROBITY project. So this is a platform to rate organisms bred for improved traits and yield. It's a £2.2 million DEFRA funded project. With 11 industry partners, led by BOFIN, and University of Nottingham is very much involved. Stacia, your involvement within the project is on the social science side. Do you just want to explain briefly, some of the aspects within the project that you're going to be looking at?
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking to farmers and to industry representatives a lot about Their perceptions of gene editing and what the potential is for this kind of technology in UK agriculture, and also talking a little bit to consumers about their perceptions and trying to identify, where there are pros, where there are cons, where there are issues that we need to overcome to develop things in the most positive way
Yeah.
possible.
So now in part one of the things that we touched on was your interest in, sort of low input farming systems, perhaps. Pests and diseases, addressing pests and diseases, and so on. Do you want to just sort of talk a little bit more about that? I mean, how do you think precision bred crops are actually going to contribute towards this area?
Yeah, so during my PhD, I spoke to a lot of farmers and I analyzed a lot of field trials data around integrated pest management strategies. And one of the findings that came out really strongly was that if you plant a highly resistant variety, then you can massively reduce the amount of pesticide that you need to spray and get a decent crop. But the issue is, of course, that we have trade offs. We have lots of different traits that we want to have in the variety that we plant, and it's difficult to get all of them into the same crop. And so you have this kind of back and forth about what you're going to prioritize in any given year in your field. We also have this issue of kind of timelines. So during my PhD, there was a disease that was a relatively new pathogen in Scotland, Ramularia on barley, and a little bit of a catch up. Like, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to cope with this new threat? And traditional conventional breeding technologies, it takes a really long time for you to develop a new variety that can cope with a new disease. But precision breeding can make that happen a lot more quickly. And because you have less drag in the breeding process, we could also potentially get varieties that do have pretty much everything on your list that you would like to see in a variety. So you don't have to make that trade off decision between, well, I could plant something that's highly resistant, but the yield's not going to be great. Or highly resistant for this disease, but it's low resistance for this other disease. We could potentially have all of them in the same crop. And I think then we could see really massive reductions in the amount of inputs that we need to be applying.
I have to say I absolutely echo what you're saying there, Stacia. I think the possibilities are really sort of quite exciting. I mean, you talk to someone like Christobal Wowie at John Innes Centre, who's developing some of these varieties, or him and his team are developing some of these varieties, and he talks about taking, for example, Skyfall, a variety that so many farmers are growing at the moment. He could take them into his lab. He could get his genetic tweezers out, or wherever they do, or the genetic scissors, do a few snips here and there, and give you a Skyfall. The problem, as many farmers will know, is that Skyfall has got a little bit of a disease problem, but he could take Skyfall, do a couple of little snips, and hand back Skyfall that has a much better disease profile. Well, in theory. I mean, I don't know. I probably simplified it horribly, and Christopher won't thank me for saying that. But actually, there are other experts within the team at John Innes Centre who are bringing forward some really quite exciting traits that have. In terms of yellow rust resistance and so on. So I think that element of things are there. But let's talk about the potential downsides. I mean, where do you think we shouldn't be going? Well, I don't know. Are there areas where we should be a little bit cautious with this specific technology, Stacia? I can
Sorry,
see I
yeah.
stumped you there.
I think that I think that we need to be careful not to repeat some of the mistakes that happened with genetically modified crops. So a lot of the early GM crops, it was things that made life easier for maybe the storage and transport, like square tomatoes that you could stack up really easily in a box, or that would last for a lot longer in the store, but they didn't actually deliver benefits that were obvious to the whole food system. So they weren't aiming for increased nutritional value. So the consumer wasn't getting a benefit from it. They weren't aiming at increased flavor, for example. They weren't aiming at reducing pesticide use, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They were focused on maybe things that were useful within the industry, but not that had wider resonance with the rest of the population. And I think that with gene editing, we need to be careful to focus, at least initially, on some of these things that offer benefits that are really obviously beneficial for everyone. And everyone can get on board with them and say, yes, I see the benefit of that. I see why you would want to do that. That makes sense. That's a positive attribute rather than
Mm.
something that maybe delivers a little bit more profit to a company that consumers don't really care that much about.
That's a really interesting point that you've made there. And if you look back at the technologies that were developed in the sort of late nineties, early noughties,
Mm.
around Roundup Ready, for example, the flavor saver tomato and things, the those traits were. I mean, did you remember the GM debate that we had back then? What lessons can we learn from that about the introduction of gene editing technology. Um, do you
I think
think,
one
Stacia?
thing is that those conversations need to happen earlier and they need to happen more openly. And we need to be more willing
Mm.
to take on board people's concerns and people's disagreements and not just say, well, if you're not on board with this technology, then we don't want to talk to you anymore. But instead say, okay, let's sit down and figure out what are the things that you're concerned about, have a conversation about the science, get everyone understanding the technology as well as we can, and make sure that that conversation is really inclusive and open.
That's a really good point that you make there, actually, and you talk about the science behind it, and that's one aspect that we are hoping that we are going to bring out into the open within the Probity project. I mean, the whole idea about this is to have an open and transparent discussion about gene editing, and as you say, we want people to be involved who are keen to know more about the technology, but also have reservations about it. We want to know and have an open discussion about it. And the other important aspect about this is that this isn't run by big business. This is not Monsanto or whatever who's behind this all. This is a farmer led project. It's all about farmers. And our perceptions, and whether we want to grow these crops and things. It's not about some big business forcing it on us at all. So any views are welcome. They are
Yeah,
not going to be ignored.
absolutely.
That's a really important thing to say. But the, yeah, just drilling down into the science there. Of course, we're talking about gene editing here, whereas previously we're talking about genetic modification. Now, just for those people who aren't aware of the difference, very simply, the difference between gene editing and genetic modification is gene editing. You're making a small edit within the genome, and it's an edit that could happen naturally. Edits to DNA happen every day to all living organisms, and it's how they repair themselves that creates a new trait in a lot of circumstances. The difference with genetic modification is that you're actually taking a length of a strand of DNA or RNA or whatever and bringing it in to the new organism in order to confer that new trait, and that can be you can transfer DNA from, for example, a bacteria into a wheat to bring a new trait. And that is a change that could not happen naturally. So that's the key difference. If you want to know more information about that, we have got more information on our website. If you go to probityproject.co.uk, we're building a resource around gene editing and genetic modification. And there are scientists who talk far more authoritatively on this topic than I do. But just thinking about that, Stacia, we are talking about a different science here. Do you think that is going to make a material difference? So this element that one is natural, well, natural, shall I put in inverted commas, as in gene editing, is perceived to be more natural, whereas GM is not. Do you think that actually makes a material difference to
I think
people?
it will. I don't know for what proportion of the population, but there are certainly people who I've had conversations with who are very anti genetic modification, who are at least open to thinking about gene editing. And I think that the genetic modification maybe opens some doors that some people find quite scary. Where does it end? You know, where you're taking the DNA from and bringing together two species that wouldn't normally be able to coexist in the same genome versus we're doing something that happens naturally. We're just speeding up that process a little bit. I think it's fundamentally a little bit less off putting for at least some people. But I'll be really interested to see when we open up these discussions and we do the survey, what proportion of people that is and what proportion of people feel differently about it.
Well, exactly. And one of the other elements within this that I think will be really interesting to explore is the role of big business. And and I said just a minute ago, the whole point of this project is that it's a farmer-led project, but it can't be denied that we're talking about technologies here that, to a certain extent, are owned by, the big companies, the Cortevas, the Syngentas, the Bayers of this world, and they will have their IP that they'll be looking to protect and make money out of, and so on. So that there is. Certainly a potential, perhaps a concern, you should say, among farmers that it's going to be they're going to be sort of led by big business or ramshackled by big business. And now, how are we going to how do we address those concerns? How do we tease them out? How do we get to the core of what these concerns are, Stacia?
I think the first thing is to understand exactly what happened with GM, and there were a lot of scare stories that went out about Monsanto suing farmers for storing seeds or cross contamination, and what actually happened in reality versus what has become the story and the kind of narrative that has built up around GM. And then from that, what can we learn and what can we say, okay, we need to do this differently with gene editing? I think that there's potential for improving the process at lots of different stages by learning from our past mistakes. So hopefully we will be doing that in this project.
Can I ask a little bit more about the detail there, Stacia? So you say we're going to be doing a little bit more about that in this project, and let's face it, type into Google genetic modification, and pages and pages and pages of stuff come up. So it's not as if there's a shortage of material out there to be going at. So how do you go about it as a scientist? How do you go about going through this potential mountain of material to actually get to the lessons that
Yeah,
need to
so
be
we're
learned?
starting out with a rapid evidence synthesis. So it's basically we're sitting down with some keywords and pulling out lots of scientific papers, but also, policy reports and stuff coming from the media about genetic modification, about gene editing, about public perception. And we're also gathering opinions from yourself and everyone at BOFIN and everyone else on the research team and our broader networks to say, where are there sources of information that you think it's really important that we include in this review that we're doing? And we'll be synthesizing all of that information down into some kind of clear messages and things that we may want to either explore in more depth in this project, maybe through the interviews that we do with farmers or the surveys that we do with consumers, or conversations that we're having with industry, or things that we think are recommendations that come really clearly out of what's already happened that we can pass on directly to policymakers or to scientists as we get going. So that's something that we started last month, and I expect it'll be several more months before we have anything clear coming out of that, but it is underway.
Fantastic, and yeah, that's one of the first things I think we're looking at, and it will be interesting. I have to remember. I have to say, I remember the great GMO debate, they called it, and it was
Mm.
a sort of government led program of debates around the country where they brought people together, stakeholders from all over the industry and consumers as well, to talk about it. I'm not entirely convinced it was the right way to go about it. And I guess the GMO debate is going to be one of the things that you're going to be looking at within the project and learning the lessons from that. Would that be? Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would agree. I think that even framing it as a debate makes it clear that we expect there to be two
Mm,
opposite sides who are going to be arguing with one another, whereas maybe we need to frame it as more of a conversation where everyone can share various opinions and we're looking for a consensus rather than one side winning over
yeah.
the other.
Another aspect that I suspect we're going to be exploring and talking about is farmers' reservations about the about being involved in the technology, and particularly potentially farmers' reservations about being involved in trials. Now, if I think back to again the GM trials that they did back in the early noughties, they were called field scale evaluations, and it was a massive program. Actually, it was a really to DEFRA's credit, it was a big program where they were looking at um, the the conditions that GM crops would bring about on farm. So they had GM crops that were grown alongside non-GM crops, and they were looking at all sorts of different factors within those crops to assess how it affected biodiversity and all of those aspects. And they had some, if I remember rightly, the findings of those crops were that actually, but because we're talking about Roundup Ready, that there was the potential to lower biodiversity within those crops through the use of Roundup, because you could. Basically spray out everything apart from the crop itself. So a bit of a no-brainer there. But the one of the aspects of that is that, of course, it was at the height of the concerns about GM crops. So there were activists who were trashing crops, and some of the farmers were targeted personally by some of these activists. I'm just interested to know your thoughts on that, Stacia. I mean, uh, do you think perceptions have moved on as far as that's concerned? I mean, do you think there would be such heightened adversaries to this technology that they could seek to derail some of the research that we're hoping to undertake within this project?
I mean, I guess you can never say never. So certainly it's possible. I do think that it's a less volatile subject, at least at the moment. Most people don't really know what precision breeding or gene editing is yet. And I think that that means that we have a window of opportunity within which people are maybe more curious than they are decided already about which side they're going to fall on in terms of stance. And so, hopefully, if we get in there nice and early and we say, okay, let's have this kind of open conversation and let's come together and talk about it and no, it's not GM, no, this is something new and different and hopefully less intimidating to people, that we can prevent that kind of volatile situation from happening. That would be my goal, my optimistic goal.
Yeah, well, exactly, and has to be said. I was thinking to myself as I was talking and I was listening to you respond there that I've kind of dwelled on the negative aspects of this technology, which is a little bit unfair because there is so much that's positive about this technology. I mean, and one of the aspects, and I wanted to ask you your views on what the opportunities are, and beyond the actual traits themselves and the opportunities that they can offer us in terms of lower inputs and better environmental profile and so on. The opportunities, sort of the more intangible opportunities, if you like. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, just to give you my perspective on this data, is one of the wheats that we've got, which is the bigger bolder fielder that we're exploring. So the gene has been found that limits grain size. And brought that into fielder wheat that we're multiplying up and we're going to be delivering onto farms in the last year of the project. We're also involving Dyson Farming, who are going to be doing some agronomy trials on it in this coming year as well, and looking at fielder and exploring. It's things like nitrogen programs. We could have a wheat that has an entirely different nitrogen program. The general approach to how you apply nitrogen, is this, that, you put a certain amount on at this timing, certain amount. We could rewrite the rule book. We could rewrite the rule book around where you apply fungicides, where you apply growth regulators, and so on, in terms of that. And that's kind of the intangible benefit, if you like. So, we could be completely exploring, a whole new agronomy. We saw an aspect of that with hybrid barleys when hybrid barley came in. That there's a different approach that you have to apply to a hybrid barley in terms of its agronomy. The opportunities with precision-bred crops are huge as far as that's concerned, and there's so much to explore there. So let me ask you, Stacia. That's my what I'm hoping to find out, or one of the aspects I'm hoping to find out from this project. What are the one of the sort of real opportunities, exciting opportunities that you can see that we can bring out of this project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that coming back to what we discussed in the first part of this podcast and the just breadth of opportunity that exists in terms of the traits that we could be looking at. And I think that one thing that I'm always interested in is win-wins and where do we stack up multiple benefits in the same space. And so, for example, if we are bringing on a crop that maybe doesn't need any pesticide sprays because it's got such good resistance to so many different pests and pathogens, maybe doesn't need much in the way of fertilizer application, anything in the way of fertilizer application. What does that change in management practice mean for the surrounding sort of agro ecosystem? So, in terms of soil compaction, in terms of soil health and biodiversity, and then potential knock on benefits for the crop in the following year and 5 years' time. And, how do we harness the potential of these new crops to develop a more resilient system and a system that is built in a way that it can cope better with climate change, it can cope better with the need to increase biodiversity and the need to still produce food in the same space, and solve some of these kind of intractable problems that we've been dealing with for a long time in agriculture. How do we kind of map everything together so that we end up in a space where we're getting all of the potential benefits? I think that's going to be a really exciting area of research, probably for quite a while. There's a lot to
Yeah,
look at there.
no, that's a really nice way to look at it. By the way, I was just thinking when you were talking there about aspects that perhaps traditional breeding hasn't looked at, and this was touched on by Professor Giles Oldroyd at Groundswell. He gave a presentation at a debate there when well, it wasn't really a debate; it was a discussion, I suppose, talking about gene-edited crops and the possibilities. And he drew attention to some of the work that they've been doing at the Crop Science Centre around arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And this is an association that's been in plants for hundreds of millions of years, but we know precious little about it and the benefits for agriculture. He was pointing out that one of the opportunities for gene editing is to really look at the genetics in crops in order to make the most of that association. And we haven't even begun to explore it, not even in traditional plant breeding. I mean, obviously, him and his colleagues have done an awful lot of research into AMF and fungi and these systems, and they're doing some really quite exciting work at the Crop Science Centre, I believe. And he was talking about the exciting opportunities there could be, once you start exploring that we haven't begun to understand yet. And that's one area, and incidentally, just on that, not so much to do with AMF, but one of the traits that we're looking at within the project, or well, it's a kind of a sideline to the project. But again, this is Christopher Wowie and his team have been looking at rooting characteristics, and they managed to edit a variety that has a deeper, steeper rooting characteristic. And looking to explore that within the project. And that's just one example. That's a sort of one that I hope we're going to be bringing out into the field in 2026 or 2027, probably through the PROBITY platform. But that's the sort of area that I think we can explore that there's rooting characteristics and those sorts of things that have never been done before. The possibilities there are huge. But again, I mean, and I don't want to bring a downside on this, Stacia, but it sounds like there are all positives here. I mean, are there any negative elements to some of these new traits that we could be bringing along? Do you think?
Well, I think that's definitely a question that is an open question at the moment. And because most of these, I mean, they've been in the lab, they've maybe been in the glass house, but as we bring them out onto farmers' fields for the first time, how are they going to perform in the real context?
Hmm.
That we'll just have to wait and
Well,
see.
that's right, and that's the important thing about that. And the important element about these trials is that we are bringing them for the first time out into farmers' fields. So the traits that so far have only ever been seen in the lab will be seen for the first time in farmers' field. The other important element about that is it can only happen in England. So gene edited crops can only be
Yeah.
grown on commercial farms in England. It's not allowed across the rest of Europe yet. They haven't done the legislation. The legislation is going through the European Parliament, but God knows when it's actually going to come out as allowed. And then it's not allowed in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland at the moment either. Only in England can this take place. So the English farmers who are going to be taking part in this, it really will be a groundbreaking project. But look, that's almost that's as much as we've got time for again, Stacia. So thank you very much, Stacia, for your for taking part in this podcast. So if you haven't heard it
Thank you.
already, do listen to part one of this podcast, and of course. If you are a basis member, you can now claim 1 CPD point from this podcast. If you also listen to part one, you can join together the two elements of the number that I'm about to give you. So if you give the two codes and you send it, you email it to cpd at basis-reg.co.uk. So that's Charlie Papa Delta at basis-reg.co.uk. And so the first part of the code we gave you in part one of this podcast. The second part of the code is /2425 for kilo. So that's /2425 /K for kilo. Join that together with the first part of the code that we gave you in part one and send it to cpd at basis-reg.co.uk to claim your point. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the BOFIN Buzz. We will be back shortly with another episode of the BOFIN Buzz. So thank you very much and goodbye.